Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Once again, if I can just say what a true honor it is for us to be guests here. Forward thinking, I mentioned briefly, only goes to places we're invited to. And I think that is a real important principle for an organization that says it's intermediation or conflict resolution. I fear if you go in somewhere uninvited, then there is a real risk you become part of the problem and not helping facilitate the finding of a solution. We talk about ourselves as being need-driven, and the needs can only be defined by the people engaged in the conflict. You cannot go in and say, well, these are the needs. We hear that far too often. I think it's up to the people to define the needs. The only things we can bring to a situation when invited are, I would say, two principles, and very important principles. One is integrity. We are who we say we are. And I think that is essential if you're going to develop a relationship of trust. But equally essential in developing a relationship of trust is transparency. If you are not transparent about the whole of your activities, who you're engaging with, again, I think you can be part of the problem. I'm going to try and sketch out where our thinking comes from. I've been involved in some way or other in conflict resolution since mid-70s. The signing of the Helsinki Agreement gave an opening for dialogue, and romantic or not, but the important thing was there was a chance to truly engage with the Soviet bloc countries, and you could engage in a very serious way. I was then a member of an organization that grew out of the Second World War called Pax Christi. And basically, it was an attempt to find reconciliation. So when Helsinki provided a broad framework, it gave us an opportunity to truly engage not just Moscow, but a lot of the Eastern European capitals in serious discussion on issues that could lead to nuclear disarmament. So it's over that. I was involved with that until the 90s. And it was over that 20 years, one discovered, I think, important things where it's how you can shift the threat of violence or actual violence into a sort of more political process. Not very successful always. I think we missed an awful lot of opportunities. I think the arrogance of the Bush administration, or Reagan, and then picked up particularly by the Bush administration, an arrogance thinking, well, we won the Cold War, I think has led us to the current situation we're facing today. There are no winners in conflict. What hopefully wins is no single winners or single groups. What is the winner if conflict, if people can learn to live with their conflicts, is basically humanity. Because as we talked about earlier, it impacts on others. One of the most important things I've learned in the last 50 years of trying to work in this world came not from experts or political scientists or, mediators, but it came from a businessman. And he wrote a book on how leadership works in business. And he was a friend. I was at that time a priest, and he was a parishioner. And there were two concepts in his book that I found extremely helpful when analyzing the roots of any conflict, no matter how complex it is. And he said, basically, when you have a problem in business, and forgive me, the businessmen in the room, you may differ, but he used the example, he said, when you have a problem in business, you approach it in one of two ways, namely, it's either what he would call a technical problem, a technical challenge, or it is what he would call an attitudinal challenge. He described the technical challenge as something you can deal with simply. It's a top-down approach. It usually requires more resources and know-how. So by applying resources and know-how, you unblock the problem and the business can go forward. But he said, if you don't get the analysis right, you might approach it in that way when actually what you're dealing with is an attitudinal challenge. And he described the attitudinal challenge as a mindset issue, that someone is locked in a mindset. And we heard that earlier today, the divine right. That is a mindset. Now, how do you move that? How do you move an attitude that is blocking progress? And his answer is only it can be achieved through engagement. And getting out there, engaging all of the people that are essential to bring on board if you're going to achieve your goal. And that you would term today as inclusive dialogue. When I took that framework and applied it, I had a chance of having a break of 3 years looking at why peace processes failed. And in applying that, it became very, very clear to me that a lot of peace processes that go nowhere begin by addressing it as if it's a technical problem, a technical challenge. Know-how and resources. And very often, if you take the Trump doctrine or the Roman doctrine, might is right, and peace through power, that just simply means you provide more money for arms and you provide better know-how for your forces. So by training up your forces and giving them more weapons, you're going to solve the problem. Well, we could be here till midnight explaining where that doctrine has gone so badly wrong and the human consequences. The other issue was what we say inclusive dialogue. That has to begin with getting what I would say, and the team here are probably sick and tired of me saying that, get the analysis right. Too often we see from the UN, from elsewhere, people come in with the mindset, top-down solutions. I think we are in the mess we're in Gaza today because Oslo was a top-down solution. It was with an elitist group, an agreement, people chosen, elitist group, imposed upon an indigenous population, and that's the way the problem was solved. And it was throw economic or benefits at it, and you won't have a problem. In the Palestinian issue, we had a great opportunity, 2006, when you had Palestinian elections, when you had an authentic leadership, and what happened? The West didn't want to deal with it at the bequest of Israel, so we isolated the people who actually then could have got into a meaningful dialogue. And we could be in a total different place today. And I think that would have an impact on the whole of the region had that happened. Anyway, moving on, essential, getting the analysis right. And Musa, stop me when I've over-talked. Getting the analysis right is essential. And I think that if we look at the literature, we'd say, the social sciences, the political sciences literature, it could be categorized into 4 areas. You have Ted Gurr, who was the big social scientist of the late 90s. Ted Gurr would say all conflicts are essentially grievance-driven. So unless you address the grievance and what we were talking earlier about peace through justice, unless you do that, forget it. you won't find a durable solution. Durable solutions doesn't mean that everyone is in agreement. It's simply people saying we can live with the differences without fighting over them, finding a way to live with our differences, but realizing that life is more important than ideology or grievance. The second area came with, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Sam Huntington, who basically said, no, conflict is essentially clash of civilization, fundamental religious differences. He said the end of the Cold War meant the ideological differences have gone. I wish they were, but they haven't. But that was the perception then when he wrote Clash of Civilizations. And the main now is the new ideological differences back to the religious differences. I worked with Huntington for 3 years, so I knew his thinking quite well. I think one of his big problems, and I think knowingly, he didn't understand religion. He didn't understand that the basics of Islam, of Christianity, of Judaism, of the Abrahamic faiths and other faiths, the basic is very similar. Our way of interpreting and the revelation we adhere to creates different, but they're not fundamental differences. And that there is more in religion that unites us than separates us. But people seized on that. And so we got the terrible thing, the conflict in Yugoslavia. And Clinton's big thing, oh, it's ancient hatreds. We can't get involved. We can witness genocide, but we can't get involved. We can't call it then. That was the big debate. We can't call it genocide because it obliges us to interfere. So what do? Ancient hatreds. They're illogical. We can't waste our time with it. That's the sad thing. But the good thing about the Huntington theory was it did bring religion back into the picture, because before that, religion was totally dismissed as irrelevant in finding solutions to conflict. Quickly moving on, the next person, Paul Collier, an economist at Oxford, put his thing in, and he said, look, don't get distracted with religion, don't get distracted with grievance. Conflict is essentially about power. It's about seizing resources, because resources gave power. And Bashir, it reminded me of our discussion last night, what you were saying with Somalia, that basically, people got power through. So he analyzed several conflicts in Africa, which he would basically say were essentially the desire to get your hands on raw material resources. That gave money, gave power, and so forth. And then lastly, in light of the Reagan years, Jack Schneider came with another theory saying, no, conflict is rush to democracy. People, the American foreign policy then was promotion of democracy. He said that is the essential thing, because what you do is you empower elites. Unless you have democratic structures in place, all you're going to do is empower these elite groups, and then you will have a source of ongoing conflict. Now, very briefly, I think I've gone over my time. I've got 2 minutes. Good. Very, very briefly. In my experience, is most conflicts are a mix. There isn't just one single cause. That you find overlaps and a mix that actually make it much more complicated in addressing. But what I would just end with in the importance of getting the analysis right, know who you're dealing with, know who you're motivated, or what their motivations, try and understand as best their causes. It is really, really essential starting point. And I think if time isn't invested in that, then we have problems. Last point, I would say that if getting to an agreement is the first stage, not the last stage. And too often we've seen people in national dialogues, in dialogues attempting to end conflict. Oh, we've got an agreement on paper. It's 30 years ago since the Good Friday Agreement was signed. There is the differences that were 30 years ago still dominating Northern Ireland politics. The agreement was essentially agreement on what we would say sufficient consensus. It's not changing people's ambition or mindset, but it's saying, look, there's enough we find we agree upon to be able to live with what we don't agree upon. But you see, if you get to that stage where you say, okay, we can take the gun out of this process and we can deal with it on a political basis, if you get to that stage, it is so important that the dialogue is sustained. Too often, those responsible for setting up these dialogues, be it at the international level of the UN or elsewhere, people say, job done, walk away. Where, as I say, that when you get to that stage where there's sufficient agreement to say this can move from the cycle of violence into a cycle of dialogue, more resources have to be given, more time is to be given, more support is to be given, because it is a long and sometimes very painful process. But at the end of the day, it is achievable. I truly believe, from the knowledge that we've been given from the discussions yesterday and listening to today, I honestly believe Yemen is solvable. And it's solvable because of you here. No outsider is going to do it. I think it is the internal dialogue that you have to find the sufficient consensus to be able to live with whatever comes out. Thanks.